By the time he got to the small home he shared with his family, he nearly fell through the front door. The last thing he remembered was falling hard on the tile floor. Sanju's mother was fixing lunch in the kitchen when she heard a noise in the front of the house. She ran into the living room and found her son collapsed on the floor. She grabbed the phone and called an ambulance, then rushed to Sanju's side and knelt down beside him. She tried to roll him over on his back so he could breathe better, but it was very difficult because of his enormous stomach. She muttered every prayer she could think of, straining her ears for the sound of a siren. And finally, in the distance, she heard it. By the time the ambulance pulled up in front of their home, Sanju was barely breathing. The paramedics quickly assessed Sanju's condition. They put an oxygen mask on him, then strapped him to a gurney and loaded him up into an ambulance. Sanju's mother wanted to go with him, but the nearest major hospital was in Mumbai, an 11-hour drive from Nagpur. All she could do was watch as the ambulance sped away with her son. Early the next morning, Dr. Ajay Mehta had just started his shift in the oncology ward at Tata Memorial Hospital. He was alerted that a new patient named Sanju Bhagat had been brought in all the way from Nagpur and that he needed to be seen right away. Dr. Mehta hurried over to Sanju's room. If someone was rushed in an ambulance from so far away, it had to be a serious emergency. As soon as Dr. Mehta examined Sanju's giant swollen belly, he instructed the nurse to prepare the operating room for surgery. Dr. Mehta was a specialist in tumor removal, and he was certain that Sanju had a massive tumor in his stomach, possibly the biggest one he'd ever seen. The tumor was likely pressing against Sanju's diaphragm, which was why he couldn't breathe. And given how big it was, and Sanju's weakened condition, the tumor had to be removed immediately. While another nurse prepped Sanju for the operation, Dr. Mehta gathered his surgical team and headed to the operating room. As they sterilized their hands and put on clean scrubs, Dr. Mehta warned them that the tumor's sheer size would make this a very challenging operation. There was a risk of damaging the soft tissue in Sanju's stomach, his nerve endings, or blood vessels. In the worst case, the surgery could cause severe internal bleeding or even death. A few minutes later, Sanju was wheeled into the operating room on a gurney. Once he was under anesthesia, Dr. Mehta called for a scalpel. He placed one hand on Sanju's stomach for leverage, then he cut into Sanju's belly. After the blade broke through Sanju's skin and opened up his chest area, Dr. Mehta expected to see blood and a bright red mass of cancerous cells. Instead, gallons of thick, yellowish fluid gushed from Sanju's stomach, spilling onto the floor. The entire surgical team gasped. Dr. Mehta jumped out of the way, trying to avoid the surge of bile. It had a foul odor that made everyone in the room start to gag. Nurses ran toward him with towels, trying to sop up the putrid-smelling liquid. While they cleaned up the mess, Dr. Mehta remained calm and carefully inserted his hand into Sanju's stomach to locate the tumor. At first, all he felt was thick jelly-like fluid sliding between his fingers. Then he grazed something unusual. His eyes went wide as he dove a little deeper. His palm wrapped around something soft, but with a brittle core. He realized this was not a tumor. Whatever was in Sanju's stomach had bones, a lot of them. Dr. Mehta's jaw dropped as his hand explored the object floating in Sanju's stomach. He grabbed onto one of the tiny bones and began to slowly pull it up and out of Sanju's stomach. As he lifted the bizarre object into the air, he could hear more gasps from everyone in the room. Dr. Mehta could hardly believe his eyes. What he was looking at shouldn't be possible. He had never seen anything like this in his entire medical career. He placed it on a medical tray for analysis and turned back to Sanju. Thankfully, he had survived the operation, but Dr. Mehta couldn't help but speculate how something so strange could have gotten inside of Sanju. A few hours later, Sanju awoke in a hospital bed. His stomach was sore, but when he moved his hand to grasp his belly, he looked down in shock. The giant lump was gone. He ran his hand over his flat stomach. He hadn't seen it like this in almost 20 years. He took a deep breath and smiled as he felt his chest expand. He couldn't believe he could breathe again without any pain. Just then, Dr. Mehta appeared in the doorway to Sanju's room with a very serious look on his face. He confirmed that the surgery was a success, but as Dr. Mehta explained what they had found inside of his body, the smile slowly faded from Sanju's face. The object Dr. Mehta had removed from Sanju's stomach was a ball of pink flesh with a tuft of dark brown hair growing along one side. 2 fully formed feet protruded from either end. In the middle was the beginning of a jawline. But what Dr. Mehta couldn't forget was the fully formed human hand that was attached to this ball of flesh. It was what he had grasped in a gruesome handshake when he lowered his hand into Sanju's stomach. The hand had fingernails protruding from it. The nails were so overgrown they almost looked like tiny claws. A grayish-yellow tube grew out of the center of the fleshy mass, connecting it to Sanju's stomach. Dr. Mehta told Sanju that the surgical staff had witnessed one of the rarest medical conditions on Earth. In a way, Sanju had been pregnant, not for the 16 years that his belly was protruding, but since before he was even born. The hairy, mutated lump he had removed was Sanju's twin. Sanju was a victim of an incredibly rare condition called fetus in fetu, which means fetus in fetus. When Sanju and his twin were first conceived, they started out as identical twins, which is when a single fertilized egg splits into 2 embryos. But something went wrong during that division, and the cells that became Sanju's twin latched onto his embryo. As Sanju developed, his body formed around the twin cells, which in turn fed off his bloodstream. This twin did not have a functional brain or heart, so it wasn't alive in the traditional sense. But as Sanju grew, so did his twin. It fed on the contents of Sanju's stomach like a parasite, using the yellowish tube as an umbilical cord. If Dr. Mehta hadn't eventually removed it from Sanju's stomach, it would have gotten so big that it would have killed Sanju. Sanju recovered physically from the surgery in just a few weeks, but when he returned to Nagpur, he was upset to find that his neighbors still made fun of him. Word had spread in the news about what had been inside of his stomach. Instead of calling him pregnant, now he was the man who gave birth to his brother. After his surgery, Sanju refused to allow doctors to follow up with his case. He never wanted a reminder that he had carried a dead twin inside of his belly. The next and final story is called One by One. In the spring of 1862, a man in London, England, named Richard Turner, sat on his son's bed. He held the sick little boy in his arms and spooned some medicine into his mouth. The child swallowed it and then let out a painful cough. Richard's wife, Elizabeth, who was standing by his side, looked at her husband with alarm. It had been a horrific few months for Richard and his family. 2 of their 4 kids had become ill and died of a deadly disease called diphtheria. As their son coughed again, both parents knew he had contracted the disease as well. In the 19th century, diphtheria was a plague across England and Europe. It caused dead tissue to build up in the back of the victim's throat. Eventually, this dead tissue would harden into a thick gray membrane, and it would become impossible for the victim to swallow or breathe. Diphtheria spread rapidly and affected children more than adults. Often, entire city blocks full of kids became sick at the same time. It was highly contagious, painful, and almost always fatal. Worst of all, there was no cure. All the doctors could do was administer a variety of tonics and hope they would reduce the symptoms enough for the patient's body to fight off the disease on its own. The Turners had brought in doctors to try and save their children, but nothing the physicians tried had worked. Now all Richard and Elizabeth could do was watch helplessly as their third child got paler and weaker from the lack of oxygen. The little boy became delirious and drifted in and out of consciousness. Just 1 week after he got sick, he died in his parents' arms. At the start of the year, they had 4 healthy children. Now they only had 1 child left, a 3-year-old girl named Anne Amelia. The Turners were completely devastated. But they were also perplexed. The rest of their neighborhood seemed untouched by this disease, while only their family was affected. The morning after their son's death, Richard went to work in a haze of grief. Over the next few weeks, they barely slept at night because they were listening for any sign of Anne Amelia getting sick too. Then, late one night, while Richard and Elizabeth were laying in bed, they heard a sound from Anne Amelia's bedroom, a tiny cough and then another. Richard's heart filled with dread. Diphtheria had come for their last child. By breakfast, Anne Amelia was visibly weak. She struggled to swallow her biscuit, and even sipping warm milk was painful. Richard and his wife couldn't just sit by and watch their last child die. There had to be someone in the medical field who could help Anne Amelia. Their neighbor told them about a doctor they'd heard of who was considered one of the best in London. His name was Thomas Orton. If anyone could help their child get better, it was him. The next morning, Richard made his way to the hospital where Dr. Orton practiced. He managed to meet with him and begged the doctor for his help. Initially, Dr. Orton was resistant to the idea. He was extremely busy, and since there was no cure for diphtheria, he was skeptical that he'd actually be able to help them. But Richard would not give up. He pleaded with the doctor to please help what was left of his family. Their daughter's life was at stake. Dr. Orton was moved. He nodded as he shook Richard's hand, and he agreed to help them. The next morning, on April 3rd, 1862, Dr. Orton packed his medical bag and left for the Turner home. The family lived in the Limehouse district, which was one of London's poorest neighborhoods. He wasn't shocked that sickness was prevalent there. The 1800s were a dark time for the entire city. The Industrial Revolution had turned London into a crowded, polluted mess. No matter where you went, it was difficult to escape the stink of raw sewage. Factories spewed toxic black smoke which permanently lingered in the air as a thick haze. Dr. Orton's carriage sped through the dense crowds, past beggars holding out hands for money, many of whom were children. Across the River Thames, trash and dead fish lined the banks. In the Limehouse neighborhood, conditions were even worse. Dr. Orton placed a handkerchief over his nose and mouth to minimize the foul smell of animal waste and rotten food that seemed to be everywhere. When the carriage finally arrived at the Turners' home, Dr. Orton stepped down onto the narrow sidewalk, then he walked to their door, braced himself, and knocked. Richard Turner opened it, looking exhausted and ashen-faced, but he lit up at the sight of this doctor and welcomed him inside. Once Dr. Orton entered the tiny front parlor, he was pleasantly surprised. The home was like an oasis in this hellish neighborhood. It was clean, warm, and well-kept. The Turners brought him into the children's room. A few toys were scattered about on the floor. Colorful drawings hung on bright green wallpaper, and fresh plants were perched on the dresser. Little Anne Amelia sat slumped on the bed against a pillow, covered in heavy blankets. She barely stirred when they entered. Her head hung to the side and her eyes were glassy. Dr. Orton could hear her struggling to breathe. The doctor opened his leather bag and got to work examining the child. He pulled out a tongue depressor and asked Anne Amelia to open her mouth as wide as she could. When he looked inside to the back of her throat, he was surprised. He couldn't see any signs of a thick gray membrane normally caused by diphtheria. This was unusual, but it also meant that the disease clearly had not progressed as far as he had feared. With treatment, maybe he had time to suppress her symptoms and give her body time to heal itself. He spoon-fed her some opium tincture to ease her discomfort and showed Mrs. Turner how to rub ointment made from coal tar on her daughter's chest. Then he shared his findings with Richard and his wife. He hoped he had gotten to Aunt Amelia's symptoms in time before the diphtheria overwhelmed her. Dr. Orton could see relief wash over the parents' faces. Now all they could do was wait. Over the next 2 weeks, Aunt Amelia did not improve. Even though Dr. Orton checked in on her and her parents tended to her night and day, she still became even weaker. And just before the end of April, the 3-year-old died. The Turners were destroyed. Their entire family had been wiped out in less than 2 months. Dr. Orton's heart broke for them. He felt frustrated and angry. He couldn't get little Aunt Amelia's case out of his head. Something just didn't seem right. The day after Aunt Amelia's death, Dr. Orton sat in his office, poring through his notes. He struggled to make sense of what had happened. Every other doctor the Turners had hired had diagnosed the children with diphtheria, and all signs did point to that being the disease they all had. Except Aunt Amelia's throat had never developed the thick membrane that normally came with diphtheria. Dr. Orton couldn't shake the feeling that something else had killed her and potentially had killed her siblings. It was a crazy thought, but if it was true, that could explain why no one else in their neighborhood had caught the highly contagious disease. Perhaps what killed the Turner children wasn't contagious after all. Dr. Orton was anxious to get more information from the Turners. So just after Aunt Amelia's passing, the doctor returned to their house. Despite their overwhelming grief, the 2 parents welcomed Dr. Orton inside, and they sat together at the kitchen table. He asked them if anything had changed recently at home. He was curious whether they had eaten any new foods or maybe met new people in the area, but the parents said no, nothing has changed. Then the doctor asked if he could check their water source. At that time, families in the Limehouse district retrieved their water from pumps located on the street. People would have to queue up with buckets or tubs and haul whatever they could back home. The doctor inspected the water, and while it was far from clean, he couldn't imagine that it was the cause of their tragedy. And if it was, he didn't understand why other families weren't afflicted as well. Dr. Orton asked the Turners to think of anything else that might have changed in the last several months, anything. Mr. Turner paused and said the only thing he could think of had happened around Christmas. They had saved enough money to buy the kids some new blankets and toys. They had even redecorated their room. The holiday season had been festive and happy, and their good cheer continued into the new year. But then, in February, everything changed. That was when their oldest child fell sick. It happened so fast, and it seemed to come from nowhere. Since then, their lives had been a nightmare. Dr. Orton listened quietly, frustrated that he couldn't glean any clues from what the Turners were sharing. He thanked them as he got up from the table, and then asked if he might take one more look inside the children's room. Richard and his wife nodded. As he walked through the empty room, everything looked the same. The toys were still on the floor, the bed had the same blankets neatly pulled back. Then the doctor's eyes flickered past the pictures on one side of the wall, and that's when he saw something that he had not noticed before. A few hours later, Dr. Orton was sitting at a table in a dimly lit pub just around the corner from his office. Across the table from him was Dr. Henry Letheby, who was a professor of chemistry and taught at the most prestigious hospital in the country, the London Hospital. As they sipped whiskey, Dr. Orton told him about the diphtheria diagnosis of the Turner children. He described how none of the treatments had improved Aunt Amelia's symptoms. Then he described how her throat had never been scarred by the leathery membrane that was so common in diphtheria. Dr. Letheby agreed that a number of things seemed suspicious, but if it wasn't diphtheria, he had no idea what else could have happened. That's when Dr. Orton shared what he had seen in the children's bedroom and why he thought it could explain the tragedy that had fallen on the Turners. Dr. Latheby thought it was a long shot, but he was intrigued by Orton's theory, and he agreed to help him test it. Anne Amelia had not been buried yet, so the next day, Dr. Orton ordered a tissue sample to be taken from her body. Then he sent that sample to Dr. Latheby for analysis. In the meantime, he ran some tests of his own on the unusual thing that he had discovered in the children's bedroom. A few days later, Dr. Latheby and Dr. Orton compared notes. They now understood the cause for the rapid and tragic deaths of the 4 Turner children, and it was not diphtheria. It all started just before Christmas. Richard and his wife wanted to make the children's room as festive as possible to celebrate the holiday season. So one Saturday, they decided to shop for new wallpaper and selected a pattern that the whole family loved. It was intricate and beautiful, and best of all, it was a stunningly bright green. The color was actually called Shayla's green, named after the designer. The shopkeeper told them it was a top seller at their store. When Richard put the paper up on the walls, the room was transformed. The 4 children were overjoyed. In fact, they were so mesmerized by the vivid green wallpaper, they tore off little pieces to play with. Sometimes they would lick it like candy. But what neither the children nor the parents realized was that there was actually a special ingredient in the dye. This ingredient helped to create that very bright green that they all loved so much, and this special ingredient made its way into the children's bodies and traveled through their bloodstreams. It saturated their lungs and caused fluid and mucus to build until one by one, it killed each child. That special ingredient was a deadly poison called arsenic. When Dr. Orton had returned to the children's room days before, he noticed that pieces of the wallpaper were missing. After questioning the Turners about the reason, and them saying their kids were ripping them off and licking them, and then after running tests on Anne Amelia's stomach and then the wallpaper itself, the mystery was solved. At that time, arsenic was used in all kinds of household products, from women's makeup to children's toys to dye for all sorts of fabric, and it was in low enough doses that at the time it was considered safe to touch. But that brand of wallpaper was the exception. Word soon spread across England about what happened to the Turner children. Dr. Orton's discovery sparked a national outrage, and concerned parents protested for the wallpaper to be banned. Dr. Orton campaigned for years until eventually the manufacturing of arsenic-based dyes was stopped. Thanks to Anne Amelia, many children's lives were saved. Sheriff was born on December 21st, 1996, to a dentist and a pharmacist. They lived in a beautiful home in Palm Beach County, Florida, which is not only one of the nicest and wealthiest places to live in Florida, but it is one of the nicest and wealthiest places to live in all of America. And that's why, as of 2021, there are 44 billionaires that call this paradise their home. In 2010, when Austin was 13 years old, his parents suddenly got divorced, and within the same calendar year, both of his parents had new girlfriends and boyfriends. Now, of course, this was a shock to Austin and to his 1 year younger sister Haley, but they both relatively quickly adjusted to their new normal. And that was in large part because the kids didn't move out. They stayed in the family home with their mom, and their father, he did move out, but he moved into a home that was very close by. About a year after the divorce, Austin began high school, and immediately he excelled. He was placed into all advanced classes, and within these advanced classes, Austin was consistently at the top of his class. Austin was also a big athletic guy. He was about 6 feet tall and weighed about 200 pounds. And so naturally, he played football for all 4 years he was in high school. And for 1 year, his sophomore year, he also wrestled. But despite his size and willingness to play these very rough physical sports, Austin was not an aggressive guy. In fact, his football coaches actually used to criticize him for not being aggressive enough. And on game days, they would try to make him mad in hopes that would inspire him to go out there and smash some people. But it really didn't work because Austin was Austin. He was just kind of a laid-back guy who was actually much more interested in helping people than smashing them. In fact, towards the end of high school, Austin became obsessed with trying to identify a career that would allow him to help the most people. And he was so passionate about this that when he spoke about it, a huge smile would kind of involuntarily appear on his face. And so because of this, and because of Austin's generally happy disposition, his father very lovingly began referring to him as the happy boy. Shortly before Austin's graduation in 2015, he received a letter in the mail from Florida State University, and it was informing him he had been accepted into their 4-year pre-med program. Austin had settled on medicine as being his intended career path to help the most people, and so being accepted into this very prestigious program was like a best case scenario. And so Austin and his family were elated, and that summer that followed his high school graduation was totally charmed. Austin was on cloud nine. He spent a lot of time with his family and his friends, and then finally at the end of the summer, his family packed all of his stuff into the car and they drove 6 hours north to Tallahassee, where the Florida State campus was. They helped move him into his dorm, and then afterwards they gave him a big hug, said good luck, and they left. And I'm sure on their ride back, the family members thought to themselves, Austin is doing so great. He is not only ready for college, he is ready to be an adult. He's ready to live on his own and be responsible. And at the end of Austin's first year in college, that supposition about him ready to be an adult seemed to be accurate. Austin got excellent grades, he met a nice girlfriend, and even though he wasn't playing organized sports like football, he had found another athletic outlet in bodybuilding, and he had actually built a decent-sized social media presence around bodybuilding and fitness. But underneath all of this public success Austin was having that year, he was actually struggling a lot of the time. He just wasn't telling anyone. In a journal he kept, he documented a deep sense of inadequacy caused primarily from his sense that his peers didn't accept him. And so he would write endlessly about how if he could just stop being so shy and be more assertive and outgoing, that more people would embrace him and would like him and would accept him. Over the course of that year, Austin also started abusing different substances. Those included things like alcohol, marijuana, and Vyvanse. Vyvanse is a drug that is a stimulant, and it's used to treat people with attention deficit disorder. He also experimented with hallucinogenic drugs like acid and mushrooms, and he also tried MDMA, which is kind of like a cross between a stimulant and a hallucinogenic. And those are just the drugs that we are aware he was taking. It's entirely possible he was taking other drugs too. Regardless, Austin began oscillating between the high of whatever drug or combination of drugs he was on to the low of his sober mind, which was totally saturated with anxious and depressive thoughts. Before the end of the school year, Austin was secretly poised for a full-blown mental breakdown, and it seemed like he knew it was coming too. In the last month before the end of school, his internet search history is filled with questions like, I think I'm crazy, what do I do? And how do you know if you're crazy? And how to deal with obsessive thoughts? And do I need to sleep? And what happens if you don't sleep? It was clear he was starting to question his own sanity. When Austin finally returned back home from Florida State that summer, his family immediately noticed there was something wrong with Austin. Within a few days of being home, Austin had moved his bed from his bedroom down into the garage, claiming that the reason he did this was because the house was full of demons. At night, instead of sleeping, Austin would patrol the house. He would literally just walk all around the house all night, never stopping, and every 2 hours he would knock on the bedroom doors of his family members and loudly announce that he was guarding them from the demons in the house. Now, you can imagine how his family felt at the time. This was so unbelievably weird and totally out of character that they just didn't really know what to do. Even though it was obvious there was something wrong, they didn't jump into action. Instead, the only thing they did at first was to just start locking their bedroom doors at night to prevent Austin from coming inside during his nighttime patrols. But as the summer progressed and Austin continued to act totally weird with no explanation, his family began to become convinced that he must be on drugs, that is what would explain all of this totally strange behavior. And so when they confronted him about his drug use, he would admit that he was taking drugs, lots of different drugs, psychedelics, stimulants, you name it. He's taking all these drugs. And so naturally, his family latched on to his drug use as being the root cause of his very strange behavior. And so they focused their efforts almost exclusively on getting Austin clean again. But towards the end of the summer, Austin said he wasn't taking any drugs, but Austin was still acting totally crazy and unhinged. And so around mid-August, the family decided they had to utilize something called the Baker Act. Under the Baker Act, individuals in Florida who are suspected of severe mental illness can be detained for up to 72 hours at the behest of their loved ones. And during these 72 hours, this individual is thoroughly assessed to see what's going on with them. And then at the end of those 72 hours, they are given a treatment plan that their family is supposed to help them enact. But before the family could utilize the Baker Act, something horrific happened. On the morning of August 15th, one of Austin's very close friends, who he had known since second grade, said Austin just showed up at his house without calling ahead of time or letting him know, which was very uncharacteristic. And when this friend opened the door to see what Austin wanted, Austin just asked him, "What year was I born?" And so the friend says, 1996. And as soon as Austin heard this, he didn't give a reaction to it. He just turned around and he left. And so this longtime friend is looking at Austin walking away, wondering, like, what's going on with this guy? Is he high on drugs? Is he drunk? Like, what was that? So the friend goes back inside his house and he's thinking to himself, what should I do? And so after a couple of minutes, he decides, I got to call Austin and make sure he's okay. So he calls Austin, Austin picks up, and it's unclear what they talked about on the phone, but the friend convinced Austin to come back to his house and to just spend the day with him. But really, the friend just wanted to make sure Austin was okay. And so Austin comes back to the friend's house, and then the two of them actually would leave the house and meet up with some of their other friends that were in town that summer, as well as meet up with Austin's sister. And so the group, they decide they're going to go to the beach for the day. And on their walk to the beach, Austin tells the group that he just needs to get something at his house and that he will meet them down at the water. And so at this point, the group believes Austin is just fine. So they say, okay, yep, we'll meet you down there. And so Austin breaks off. He goes to his house. And when he goes back to the beach and meets up with his group of friends again, he's changed his outfit. He was now wearing this very thick, large football jersey. He was wearing long sweatpants that were also very thick. He had on 2 wristwatches and he had on sunglasses. And so as he walks down onto the beach, his friends look up at him and it's super hot out and they're at the beach. So this is a totally weird outfit to have on. And immediately they start kind of giving him crap about his strange outfit choice. But Austin did not think it was funny at all. And at first he was quiet, but then he kind of lashed out and said, "If you tell me I'm crazy, I will kill you." And at this, his friends did not give him any more crap. Everyone just said, "Okay, man, hey, didn't mean anything by it, just giving you a hard time, no big deal." But Austin's clearly worked up, and so his sister comes over to him and she's like, "Hey, calm down, it's okay, it's not a big deal." And during this conversation, Austin suddenly goes back to being normal again, and he turns to his sister and he says, "I'm actually half horse and I'm immortal." And his sister's like, "What? You really need to get professional help. You need to see a therapist or a psychologist or something. Something is wrong with you, and it's been wrong all summer. You need to get help." Now, apparently, Austin actually responded to this very positively. And he said, "I agree. There is something going on, and I do need to get help. You're right." And so after that, Austin and the rest of the group, they stayed at the beach for several hours. And then in the evening time, Austin, his sister, and Austin's very close friend, who was the guy that saw Austin in the morning when he asked, what year was I born, they all said they had to leave. And so the trio, they leave the beach and they head to Duffy's, which was a restaurant in town. And they were going there to meet up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend. And so as they're getting to this restaurant, they're walking along the sidewalk, they're nearing this restaurant, when suddenly Austin turns to his sister and says, "Hey, I need to test out my immortality." And he just turns away from her, away from the sidewalk, towards traffic, and just starts walking into traffic like he's going to let a car hit him to test his immortality. And so his sister immediately was able to grab him and pulled him back onto the sidewalk, and then basically stood on the left side of him, preventing him from running out into traffic, and kind of pushed him along up the sidewalk right up to the front door of this restaurant. And when they got there, Austin had stopped trying to walk out into traffic. He was acting normal again. And it was there that the trio met up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend, girlfriend, and the 5 of them went into Duffy's restaurant. It was about 7:45 p.m. when they got inside, and they were very quickly sat in the very back of the restaurant in this booth. And so there was a CCTV camera that watched them while they were inside this building. And so they're sitting at this booth, and about 3 minutes after having sat down, Austin gets up and walks away from the booth and walks as if he's going towards the bathroom, but then stops, doesn't go to the bathroom, turns around and walks back towards the front of the building, and then walks out the front doors, just leaves the restaurant altogether. Now, it's unclear if the rest of his family saw him do this. It doesn't seem like they did, but just a minute later, Austin comes back inside the restaurant and just walks right back to his table and sits down like nothing had ever happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Austin would get up again from his table, except this time, instead of feigning going to the bathroom, he just walks straight from his table right out the front doors of the restaurant and disappears. A couple minutes later, Austin's mother, who was not at dinner with them, she was at her home, which happened to be nearby this restaurant, she was home when she heard the sound of someone coming into her house. And so she went around to see who it was, and she found her son, Austin, in her kitchen, drinking vegetable oil, and there was Parmesan cheese all over the counter that apparently he had been eating as well. And so she runs up to him and she grabs the vegetable oil and she puts it down and she tells him to stop, at which point Austin does stop. And then I guess Austin just went up to his room and he changed out of his clothes because perhaps he got oil all over his shirt. And then his mom just drove him back to the restaurant. And so she watched him get out of the car and she watched him go through the front door, and then she drove off. And so about 30 minutes after he left that second time, Austin walks through the front doors of the restaurant. He's got a different shirt on, different hat on, and he just walks to the back of the restaurant where his sister, his friend, and his father's girlfriend are, and he sits down like nothing had ever happened. At first, it looks like everyone at the table is just silent. But then Austin's father very clearly said something to Austin, and it seems kind of hostile. And it would turn out Austin's father, who loved his son, was just totally at a loss for what to do with him, and he said to Austin when he sat back down, "What is wrong with you?" And at this, Austin just stands up and presses his father's face back up against his seat, kind of pinning him there, and then at some point he just lets go, he leaves the booth, and he walks right out of the restaurant for a third time. Austin's friend, who was eating with them, he got up and kind of chased after Austin, but he was about 30 seconds behind him, and so by the time he got outside, he didn't know where Austin went, and so he quickly came back in the restaurant. He told the rest of the group he didn't know where Austin was, and so at this point, Austin's father's girlfriend would actually call the police and report Austin missing. They knew he was totally unhinged, and they didn't know where he was going to go, if he was a threat to himself or someone else, and so they figured they should just tell the police and have the police go find him. About 4 miles away from this restaurant, 53-year-old Michelle Mishcon was sitting in her garage watching TV. Normally, she would be joined by her husband, 59-year-old John Stevens, but he was out walking their dog. So for the time being, Michelle was alone. The couple had been married for roughly 20 years. They had 3 kids together from previous marriages, and they were just totally in love with each other. That garage was like their happy place. That was basically like their living room. They loved having the door wide open so they could wave to neighbors and flag people down to have a drink with them or just chat with them. They were just known to be a very happy, loving couple that were fun to be around. And according to their kids, they had both recently retired. John retired from his landscaping company that he owned, and Michelle retired from her financial advisory job, and the two of them were apparently both just really excited about retirement life. They were excited to spend more time together and go out with their friends and go out fishing on their boat with their dog, and then also spend as much time as they could just lounging back in their garage. John and Michelle's neighbor across the street was a middle-aged man named Jeff Fisher. Jeff was fairly close with the couple. He would usually watch their dogs anytime they went away, and he would often go in their garage and have a drink and just kind of hang out with them. And so this particular night, he was over in his house and he was going to bed early. So he laid down in his bed, he's getting ready to go to sleep, when he hears some strange sounds coming from outside his window across the street over near John and Michelle's property. And so Jeff sits up in his bed and kind of strains his ears to see what it was that he heard. And as he's trying to listen for some faint sound, he suddenly hears a blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream, coming from across the street. And so Jeff instantly leapt into action. He jumped out of his bed, he ran downstairs, and he ran out his front door, and he looked across the street, and he saw this unknown man, some young man that was slamming the car door of Michelle's car that was parked in her driveway, and he begins walking up the driveway, and at the top of the driveway, driveway, Jeff sees Michelle is standing in the garage, and she looks totally terrified, and she's facing this unknown young man. And of course, this unknown young man was Austin Harif. Now, Jeff had no idea what was actually going on. All he knew was he heard this scream, which was probably Michelle, and he's looking out there and he's seeing a situation that just doesn't look good. And so instinctively, he decided he would just run across the street and make sure Michelle was okay. And if he had to, he would confront this unknown man, Austin. So Jeff begins running across his property, trying to get across the street to Michelle. But before he could even get across the street, he's looking up and he can see this guy, Austin, has grabbed Michelle and thrown her on the ground. And now he's on top of her and he's beating her. And so Jeff runs onto the driveway. And as he's going right up the driveway between the two cars that were parked there, Austin leaps off of Michelle. He turns around and he looks at Jeff and he says, "You don't want a part of this." And now Jeff, he's a pretty big guy. And so he's looking at Austin and he knows that if he doesn't do anything, this guy is just going to continue pummeling poor Michelle. And he had no idea where John was. And so he ran up and kind of lunged at Austin. And as he did that, Austin swung and he hit Jeff right across the side of the head. But Jeff took the hit. He didn't fall down. He grabbed Austin by the collar and threw him as hard as he could to the ground. And Austin, he hit the pavement hard, face first. And so Jeff is looking at this guy, kind of thinking he's not going to get up. But as he's assessing the situation, watching Austin stand back up again, Jeff suddenly feels a blinding pain in his face, in the side of his head, in his neck, on his back. And he looks down and he sees blood all over his arms. It's everywhere. He's covered in blood. It would turn out Austin was carrying a knife. And so when he punched Jeff, that knife went into his face, it cut the side of his head, it cut his neck, and it cut his back. He had 5 different puncture points from that one swing. And so Jeff believed at the time this was a potentially fatal wound. He was worried perhaps his jugular had been struck and he was bleeding to death. And he's seeing Austin stand back up, coming right after him with this knife. And so Jeff decides their only chance is for him to run and call the police. And so he runs into Michelle's property. He's thinking that he's kind of drawing this guy towards him away from Michelle. He runs into their property, kind of slams into all their doors. He goes out a back door and then he loops around the property and then he makes a run for it straight across the street to his house. Never once did he turn around to see if this guy was after him. He figured he was right behind him. He gets to his house, he runs inside, he locks the door, and then he calls 911.
Police and medical. Young man beating up a woman across the street.
Are either of them injured? Can you tell from where you are?
Yes, there's a girl laying on the ground. He beat her up. I ran over there. I'm bleeding profusely here at the moment.
Okay.
I don't know what happened.
Can you tell if she's conscious?
No, it does not appear so, no. I've been stabbed in the back. I'm bleeding pretty bad.
After the call is placed and Jeff is certain that help is on the way, he's barely conscious, but all he can remember thinking was, I hope this maniac, Austin, has abandoned his attack and just run off. Or I hope John has come outside and he's helping his wife. But unfortunately, all Jeff could hear was the sound of Austin across the street making these loud, animalistic grunting sounds. And at the same time, he hears the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs. He doesn't even know if it's one person, if it's 2 people, if it's male, if it's female. All he hears is screams and grunting sounds. And then seconds later, the police show up. The following narrative is the account of the second responding officer, who we'll just call Dan, and the first responding officer we'll just call Kristen. And so Dan, he comes flying down the street, he's got his sirens on, and he pulls in right behind Kristen's cop car, which is parked right out in front of John and Michelle's property. Kristen is already running up the driveway, her gun is out, she's getting ready to engage somebody at the top of the driveway. And so Dan, he hops out of his car, he's got his hand on his gun, and as he turns to run up the driveway, his view is obscured. There are 2 cars parked in the driveway, and so he can't see what's at the top of the driveway that Kristen is apparently getting ready to draw her gun on. But as he begins running up the driveway, he sees there is this massive 6-foot wide stream of blood just coming down the driveway. And so he goes around the left side of the left car, he goes up and he sees Kristen right at the top of the driveway. She's got her gun aimed at the ground right in front of the car, so he can't see what's in front of the car yet. He comes bombing around the left side right behind Kristen, and he looks down at what she's aiming her gun at, and he sees there's this man lying on the ground, his eyes are open, Dan, he's just laying there kind of stiff, and he's looking up at Kristen and he's looking up at Dan, and he's just quietly saying, "Please help me." The man on the ground was John Stevens, and on top of John Stevens was Austin. He was kind of laying sideways on John's chest. He had his left arm wrapped around John's neck to kind of hold him in place, and then he had his right arm and he was doing something to John's face. But Dan couldn't really tell what he was doing. All he could take in was there was clearly an aggressor and they needed to get him off of the victim. But Kristen could not take the shot because if she did, she ran the risk of firing the bullet through Austin into John, killing John. And so Dan tells Kristen, "Hold on, I'm gonna tase him." And so he moves around Kristen to her left side, so he's positioned looking down at the back of Austin. He pulls out his taser, and right before he shoots his taser into Austin's back, he sees what Austin is doing to John's face. With his free right hand, he was reaching into John's mouth and pulling his cheek out, kind of like a fishhook. He was pulling it out as far as he could, and then he was biting into John's cheek, and he was ripping out pieces of flesh and chewing and swallowing them. And from his position, Dan only saw this for a second, but he suddenly noticed, and Kristen, the other officer, would later confirm, there were all these chunks already missing from John's face. And so Dan kind of snapped out of what he was seeing and fired his taser into the back of Austin, but it did nothing. It had absolutely no effect. Austin was entirely focused on biting John's face. That was all he was doing. He wasn't even registering that there were cops with their guns drawn on him. It was like they weren't even there. And so Dan runs back around Kristen to the other side of her. He's now on her right side, so he's standing right next to the car, looking down at Austin's front. And he tells Kristen to kind of back up for a second, and then Dan winds up and kicks Austin square in the face, knocking his head off of John's face. But as soon as Austin comes off of John, he doesn't get up and try to fight with Dan. Instead, he just jumps back down, gets a deeper grip on John, and plunges his mouth back onto John's face. And so again, Dan winds up and boots Austin square in the face, knocking his head back. But again, he's totally unfazed. He doesn't want to attack the officers. He just wants to eat John's face. And so he goes right back down, gets a tighter grip. He goes back and he starts chewing on John's face again. And so Dan was just repeatedly kicking him in the face over and over and over again, right as another set of officers showed up, and they had a canine, they had a dog. And so they come flying up, they kind of see the situation, and Dan tells them, "Release the dog." And so sure enough, they release the canine. The canine clamps down on Austin's right arm, the arm that was fishhooking and kind of pulling John's face out. And the dog really got a good bite on his arm and yanked it away from John's face. But Austin just instantly ripped his arm back, doing severe damage to his arm from the dog's teeth, and just repositioned himself and went back to biting John's face. And so the dog, just as it was trained, did another bite. It grabbed back onto Austin's arm and it pulled it off of John's body. And so his arm is back like this again. And Austin, again, unfazed, just yanks his arm out of the dog's teeth, again, shredding the muscles of his arm, and gets back in position and continues to eat John's face. And then finally, the dog gets another bite into Austin's arm, and this time when the dog managed to yank Austin's arm away from John, Dan timed it so he booted Austin square in the face right as his arm was being pulled back, and he hit him hard enough that Austin actually flew off of John and landed on his back. And as soon as he was on the ground, Dan actually leapt over John and landed on Austin's face, smashing his head into the cement, which kind of stunned him for a second. And as soon as he was stunned, Dan whipped out his handcuffs, threw it over one of Austin's wrists, and began pulling him by the handcuff up the driveway away from John. But as soon as he had some separation and Dan went to put the other handcuff on Austin, Austin began fighting back, and he looked up at Dan and he screamed, "Kill me! I'm eating humans! Kill me!" Dan didn't even know what to do, and so he's trying to put the other handcuff on him. The whole time Austin is screaming, "Kill me! Kill me!" And so other officers had to run in, and then finally, after 3 other officers came over, they were able to hold Austin down long enough to get both handcuffs on him. After Austin was finally restrained, the officers checked on the victims. They checked on Michelle, who was in the garage, and unfortunately she was deceased. She had died from blunt force trauma. And John, even though he had been alive when the police first showed up, he had succumbed to the multitude of injuries he had sustained, from stabbings to beatings to having a portion of his face ripped off. It's believed after John came back from his walk, which would have been right after Jeff had been attacked and ran back to his house, John saw Austin in his garage attacking his wife, and John ran in to try to save her. And so ultimately John would die trying to save the woman that he loved. Their dog would survive the attack. It was unharmed, and it was given to one of their children to take care of. And Jeff Fisher, the neighbor who tried to save John and Michelle, he would survive the attack and make a full recovery. After Austin was finally handcuffed and was laying restrained on the driveway, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, where it was determined he had drank some poisonous chemicals, most likely from inside of John and Michelle's garage, and that was what was causing his organs to fail. Ultimately, Austin would go into a coma for 11 days from whatever he ingested, but the doctors were able to save his life, and so he would come out of that coma and he would make a full physical recovery. It was initially assumed that because of Austin's drug abuse history, that he must have been on some drug when he perpetrated this heinous crime. It was speculated that he could have been on bath salts or flakka, which are these synthetic hallucinogenic drugs, which are very powerful, and at the time they were quite popular in Florida, and they'd caused some other users to go on these kind of wild, violent rampages. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that he must have been on one of those. But when Austin's toxicology report finally came back, it showed he only had a very small amount of THC in his system, which is the drug found in marijuana, and then the other drugs that were in his system were all induced by the doctors and nurses at the hospital, which meant at the time of this attack, Austin was effectively sober. When the police asked Austin, "Why did you do this?" he initially said, "I don't remember, I don't know," but eventually he would open up and he would tell this story that no sane person could possibly understand. He said after he left that restaurant where his family was that third time, after he fought with his father and he stormed out, after that, he saw this dark figure outside with a white face. And he knew immediately that this figure was evil. And so instinctively, Austin began running away from this evil figure. And so he ran about 4 miles into John and Michelle's neighborhood. And when he got to this neighborhood, a neighborhood he was not familiar with, that he didn't intend to go to on purpose, he just kind of wound up there, he said he saw this brightly lit up garage, and he ran up into it, believing he could enlist the help of the people inside of this house, and that they would help him defeat this evil figure that was lurking somewhere nearby. And so he runs up into this garage, which happens to be John and Michelle's garage, and Michelle is in there. John is not. He's out for the walk with his dog, and Austin approaches her and tries to get her to help him, but he probably came off looking completely insane, and Michelle screamed. At which point, Austin said he believed Michelle was a witch, and so he pulled out his knife and he attacked her. And then after she fell to the ground, Austin said he drank a bottle of alcohol or something, which we now know was most likely very poisonous lawn chemicals that was just in the garage. After he drinks that bottle, he turns around and now he's looking out of the garage towards the street. And he said he saw this other figure in the doorway with a dog next to him. And then Austin said his mind just went blank. It's believed the figure he saw in the doorway was John Stevens returning from his walk, but we don't know for sure, and frankly, this story is pretty incoherent to begin with, because it doesn't account for the fact that before John came back, Austin had been grappling with Jeff Fisher and stabbing Jeff Fisher, the neighbor. But Austin would say he has no recollection of encountering Jeff Fisher, he has no recollection of John or what he looked like, and he certainly doesn't remember biting John's face, and he had no memory of any interactions with police. He said that basically he turned around, he sees this figure, this dog, and then his mind went blank, and then he woke up about 2 weeks later in the hospital. Now, when his story went public, a lot of people just were not willing to accept that story. They said he was making it up so he could plead insanity at his trial and get a lesser sentence. But a world-renowned forensic psychologist named Philip Resnick, who had worked on many high-profile cases before, he did a lengthy assessment of Austin, and he came to a very different conclusion than the public. In his 38-page report, Resnick points out the fact that Austin continued to bite John's face even when he was being openly threatened with being shot by the police officer standing right over him. He continued to bite John's face after he was tased. He continued to bite John's face after he was kicked in the head repeatedly. He continued to bite John's face after a dog repeatedly bit him. This all suggests that Austin was truly in a psychotic state when this attack occurred. A sane person, even under the influence influence of drugs will retain a basic survival instinct. They will try to protect themselves. So when there are guns pointed at them, or they're being physically harmed, or there's threats of violence, they'll do things to protect themselves. But Austin didn't. It was like he had no idea about anything else except John's face. Resnick specified that the type of psychotic episode that Austin was Gina would be kept alive by machines. She would need to be kept in the coma for at least 10 days, hopefully long enough to fight off what was attacking her body. Dr. Willoughby admitted they would be gambling with Gina's life. No one had ever attempted anything like this before. If it didn't work, Gina would surely die. And even if the doctor's plan worked, and Gina's body managed to fight off the disease, there was no guarantee that she would even wake up from the medically induced coma. Her brain might never be able to regain its proper functions, and she would be left in a vegetative state dependent on machines to keep her alive for the rest of her life. The thought of that sent a shiver down Anne's spine, but if they wanted to save her daughter's life, this was their only option. Anne looked to John, and he nodded. And so, with all the courage she could muster, Anne gave Dr. Willoughby the go-ahead. On October 10th, Dr. Willoughby and a surgical team gathered in the operating room. Gina was brought in, and the anesthesiologist administered drugs to induce a medical coma. The coma would help to regulate her routine brainstem functions, such as breathing and circulation. After the procedure was completed, Gina was wheeled back to the ICU. Dr. Willoughby barely left the hospital for the next few days. He would walk by Gina's room and hear the steady sounds of the machines that had taken over her body functions. He would see her parents were praying at her bedside. Dr. Willoughby prayed silently for Gina too. 10 days passed. The waiting was unbearable. Dr. Willoughby spent every moment anxiously hoping this treatment would work, and Gina's parents spent every possible second by their daughter's bedside. Finally, it was time to take her out of the coma and see if her body had been able to fight off this disease. Throughout the day, Dr. Willoughby lessened the amount of drugs that were keeping Gina asleep. If everything had worked, she'd soon be able to wake up on her own. But as the hours ticked by, the monitor tracking her brain activity was still a flat line. This was a bad sign. If the monitor didn't start showing something soon, Gina might never wake up. When Dr. Willoughby came into work early the next morning, he ran to Gina's room and checked her brain activity monitor again. The screen showed a flat line with the tiniest blips of movement on it. That meant Gina's brain was working. Dr. Willoughby breathed a sigh of relief. He couldn't believe that his plan might actually work. But Gina still had not actually woken up from the coma. When Anne and John arrived at the hospital later that morning, Dr. Willoughby led them over to Gina's bedside. He positioned Anne right over Gina's face. Then he opened Gina's eyes with a speculum, which is a tool eye doctors typically use to keep patients from blinking. Dr. Willoughby watched Gina's pupils flood with light, going big as saucers. Then they started to move. Gina was awake. Dr. Willoughby could see her eyes darting from right to left, looking all around the room, and then finally her eyes settled on her mother's face. Gina's pupils went wide with recognition, and Dr. Willoughby knew she had recognized her mom. Anne realized it too. She flashed Dr. Willoughby a grateful smile, her eyes welling with tears, and Dr. Willoughby breathed a huge sigh of relief. He took out his reflex hammer and tapped Gina's knee. But, to his surprise, she didn't flinch. He tried again, but there still was no reaction. Dr. Willoughby's stomach turned. Even if Gina was still groggy, her body should have naturally had a reflex. He tried to keep a neutral expression, but he knew Anne and John could tell something was wrong. He didn't know how to tell them that Gina was awake, but physically she was paralyzed. She was literally locked inside of her body. The condition is actually called being, quote, locked in, and it's a rare disorder of the nervous system. People with locked-in syndrome are paralyzed except for the muscles that control eye movement. They're conscious and can think and reason. They can hear and see, but they can't move or speak, and they can't chew, swallow, or breathe on their own. And there was nothing Dr. Willoughby could do to help Gina. Their only hope was to wait and see if anything changed. That night, as he drove home, Dr. Willoughby prayed to God for forgiveness. He felt like he had sentenced Gina to a fate worse than death. She could spend the next 60 years as a prisoner in her own body, able to think and reason and feel, but never move. He could imagine how terrifying it would be for Gina to be going through this, after almost dying of a deadly disease. When Dr. Willoughby returned to the hospital the next day, nothing had changed. Gina's eyes darted around the room, but her body remained motionless on the hospital bed. And the day after that was exactly the same. On the third morning after Gina had woken up, Dr. Willoughby arrived at the hospital full of dread. He stopped at Gina's room first and grabbed her chart from its holder on the door. Then he walked to Gina's bedside and removed the reflex hammer out of his breast pocket. Holding his breath, he gave her knee a soft tap. Gina flinched. A short time later, Anne and John arrived in Gina's room, and Dr. Willoughby excitedly asked them to watch as he tapped Gina's knee. Again, her muscles contracted, and Gina's parents went wide-eyed. After 2 weeks of surviving on slim threads of hope, they started crying, this time out of joy. 3 months later, Gina took a deep breath and opened her eyes. She was back home in her bedroom. Even though she'd left the hospital a week ago, she still worried that she'd wake up in that awful bright white hospital room, hooked up to machines, unable to move. Coming out of the coma had felt like being underwater. She could hear the muffled voices of people she knew and see the blurry outlines of their faces. But it wasn't until Dr. Willoughby pried her eyes open that she finally broke through the surface. It had taken days for the feeling to return to her body. First, she was able to flutter her eyelids. Then she was able to twitch her fingers. Eventually, she could feel her mother holding her hand. But even as the world began to snap into focus, Gina just couldn't move very well on her own, and even though she understood what others were saying to her, she couldn't speak back. Her parents and the nurses at the hospital had to do everything for her, like bathing and feeding her, and she would spend 2 months relearning how to walk and how to say basic words. But Gina was very grateful to be alive, and while her time in the hospital was a total blur, she remembered every detail of how her deadly illness had started. One month before her symptoms had appeared, Gina and her family had gone to Sunday Mass together at St. Patrick's Catholic Church. A few minutes after Mass started, Gina looked up and spotted something small and black flying around the ceiling. It was a little bird who was trying to get outside, but it wasn't moving toward any of the open windows. Instead, it was swooping down towards the pews, a little lower each time. Most of the congregation was totally annoyed and kept swatting at it with their hats when it flew down. Then the bird grazed an usher who managed to knock it out of the air with a collection basket, and it fell to the floor and appeared stunned. Gina was an animal lover, and she felt bad for the little bird, so she got up from her seat and hurried to the back of the church, and she scooped it up. But as Gina carried this little bird in her hands, she got a closer look and realized it wasn't a bird, it was a bat. Outside the church, she opened her hands to let it go, but the bat bit her finger hard. Gina almost screamed, but she knew there were little kids watching her from inside the church, and she didn't want to scare them. So she bit her lip and whipped her hand away from the bat, sending it flying across the church lawn. Gina watched as the bat flew away and then cradled her finger. A small pinprick of blood bubbled up where the bat had broke the skin. Gina washed her hands in the bathroom and then snuck back into the church pew beside her parents, smiling as parishioners looked over and flashed grateful looks at her. Gina would tell her parents that the bird was actually a bat, but it never occurred to Gina or her family that the moment the bat's tiny fangs pierced Gina's skin, a lethal pathogen had latched onto one of the nerves in Gina's fingertip. And over the next month, that pathogen replicated and grew, crawling its way up Gina's arm and rooting in her brain. It caused her to have flu-like symptoms, blurred her vision, made her jerk and salivate uncontrollably, and eventually led her to Dr. Willoughby's care. But at that point, it was too late, because Gina now had rabies. Rabies is an acute viral infection that is transmitted to humans by a bite or by the exposure of broken skin to an infected animal's saliva. The most common wild animals that can transmit rabies to people are raccoons, skunks, bats, and foxes. Domestic mammals can also get rabies if they're unvaccinated, like cats, dogs, and cattle. Rabies can be cured with a vaccine, but it must be given within 24 to 72 hours after exposure. If it's left untreated, rabies is fatal. The virus causes significant and progressive damage to the brain and spinal cord, and by the time it's reached the brain, it's almost always too late to prevent death. Victims die painful deaths and experience delirium, abnormal behavior, hallucinations, and insomnia. But thanks to Dr. Willoughby's radical idea, Gina Geese became the first person to survive a case of full-blown rabies without a vaccine. Since then, other doctors have used the technique Dr. Willoughby pioneered to treat rabies patients when they are not eligible for the vaccine. It doesn't work every time, but sometimes the patient does pull through. It's now known as the Milwaukee Protocol. It took Gina 2 years to restore her language and motor skills, but she finished high school on time with the rest of her class, and then after graduation, she enrolled at Lakeland College to study biology because she wants to work with animals. In one of her classes, Gina studied bats, and over time, her fear of them melted away. Now, she absolutely loves them.
Some call this location the most paranormal location on the planet. Others call this whole thing just a big hoax. But what is undeniably true, and frankly what makes this case so much more interesting, is that unlike the vast majority of paranormal stories and claims, this case was put to an enormous amount of scientific scrutiny. In fact, there was a decade-long study done on this case, where PhDs and scientists converged on this one location and basically around the clock studied, all these claims of the paranormal that was happening in the area. And after a decade of research, the findings are pretty mind-blowing. And the case that I'm referring to is none other than the very famous Skinwalker Ranch. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have a family that purchases a ranch out in Utah, and as soon as they move in, they start noticing some pretty bizarre things around their property. Everything from, some of their livestock going missing or being harmed. They have strange sightings in the woods of creatures and lights in the sky. They eventually report it to the news, and that news story gets picked up by a couple of other outlets, and a billionaire who is obsessed with researching the paranormal sees this story. He buys the property and installs an entire team of scientists and researchers to basically try to figure out what was happening at this ranch. And they spend 10 years studying this ranch. The outcome is, turns out some strange things really were happening there. Before we get started, if this type of content appeals to you, the kind of strange, dark, mysterious content delivered in a story format, if that appeals to you, that's what my channel's all about, and I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, please gently ransack the like button and then turn on all notifications so you can get all of my content every time I upload every week. All right, on with the story. In the northeastern corner of Utah lies a 500-acre plot of land, it's all desert, where a ranch sits, and that is Skinwalker Ranch. It was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was actually built on a piece of land that had apparently been cursed. Prior to its construction, the Navajo tribe had a feud with the Utes Native American tribe. The Utes were selling off other Native Americans that they would capture. They would sell them into slavery to the United States. And so the Navajo, who had previously lived in the area where this ranch actually was built, they were forced off their land as the Utes came in and were rounding them up and selling them into slavery. And before the Navajo left that area, they cursed the land with what's called the Skinwalker curse. The idea was they were going to torment the Utes tribe for the hardships they had inflicted on the Navajo. The Skinwalker curse, legend has it, is this curse where these witches descend on the area and take the form or wear the skin of various predatory animals in the area, namely large wolves and foxes. they inhabit those bodies and terrorize anybody in the cursed land. At some point, this ranch is actually built on the land that had apparently been cursed. It wasn't until many years later when owners of that ranch started seeing predatory animals doing some very strange things in and around their property that they did some research on the area, learned about this curse, and then before long, the nickname had stuck. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman purchased Skinwalker Ranch. It had actually been abandoned by the previous owners for the last few years, so when they purchased it, they got it for way below market price. So they are just so excited to be moving in. They breed cattle, and so they had 500 acres to let their cattle free roam. It was like the dream purchase for this family. And so when they finally do move in, like the day they move in, they don't really care that the grass is overgrown. It looks like things are kind of in disrepair. And in fact, when they go into the homestead, like the actual house on the property, they were so excited about everything that they kind of overlooked some of the strange things that they immediately noticed about the property. They go inside and every window has a deadbolt on it. The inside and outside of every door in the house, not just the doors leading outside, doors leading between rooms had locks, the front and back side. They noticed these big pikes that were driven into the ground at the front door and back door of the property with massive chains stringing off of them, which looked like pretty powerful guard dogs had been there. They're thinking to themselves, well, this is a huge piece of property. Perhaps the previous owners are a little bit paranoid because they're kind of isolated. And so they didn't really raise a red flag when, to be honest, had I moved into a property where every single door and window had multiple locks on it, they had these big guard dogs, I'd probably ask a couple questions. But you know what? Terry and Gwen, they're just so excited about this purchase that, again, they kind of just overlook it. So on the day that they are moving in, Terry and Gwen have some family members over to help them offload trucks and move stuff into the homestead. And it's during this process as they're moving things out of the truck into the house. And again, you got to remember that the house is situated like right in the middle of the property, and you can see in every direction basically unobstructed because it's basically open desert, with the exception of a couple areas that are, basically forests. And as they're offloading some of the stuff into the house, Terry looks out at one of these tree lines and he notices this huge wolf, or what looks like a wolf, pretty well off in the distance, kind of meandering its way over towards them. But it's far enough off that this is not enough to be totally worried about it. After all, Terry was a rancher and his family were fairly rugged. They carried weapons and they were used to, protecting their livestock from predators. So this was not a, oh my goodness, I can't believe a wolf is near us. It was more like, okay, let's make a note that there's a wolf walking towards us. And so Terry he tells his family, hey guys, just so you know, there's a wolf coming towards us right now. And the whole family is now standing near the truck and they're watching this wolf. And Terry recalled as he's staring out watching this wolf that's kind of almost walking in like a snake, like a serpentine path towards them from hundreds of yards out. It's still quite a ways out. Terry notices that there was a fence that was out where this wolf is. And the fence was pretty big, and the spaces between posts were about 6 feet. When he had a good look at the wolf next to the fence, he could tell that the wolf was at least 6 feet long. And he was thinking, are my eyes playing a trick on me? Like, that's an enormous wolf. That's the biggest wolf I've ever seen. But the wolf wasn't acting angry or aggressive. It was just kind of skulking its way towards him, very nonchalant, broad daylight. And at some point, Terry and the family, they're standing behind the truck, and Terry said that they all had this feeling that the wolf was not going to harm them. And the wolf got about 100 yards away, and Terry and his family are transfixed. And he even said he didn't understand why they weren't scared or why they weren't, running away or shooting at it or something, but they didn't. All of them are just standing there watching this wolf that's massive. And the wolf is wagging its tail and acting like a domesticated dog. The wolf comes over and goes up near Terry's father, who was there helping unload some of the gear they had. And Terry's father just kind of reflexively reaches out to start petting this. He's petting like up at his head level, this massive wolf. And the wolf just acts like a domesticated dog and kind of rubs against his hand and then starts walking away from them, just wagging its tail and not doing anything, not causing them any harm, not snarling, not growling, nothing. But just as nonchalantly as it walked over to them, it walks over to where they had a pen with a couple of cows and calves inside of this pen. And one of the calves had its head through the post that was keeping them in this cage, just kind of watching this wolf. And the wolf notices it and in an instant jumps over to this calf and immediately has the whole head of the calf in its jaws, just trying to rip it out of the cage. But it can't get it to squeeze through the cage. And so all of a sudden, like Terry and his family are broken out of this weird trance. And Terry starts firing shots at the wolf. It strikes the wolf and has no impact. They run over, they start hitting it with the back end of an axe. They're trying to get this thing off of the calf because their livestock, that was their livelihood. And these are rugged people, and so they're trying to fight to save their property, to save their cows. And the wolf is just totally unaffected. It's not trying to attack Terry or his son that are trying to get rid of it. The wolf is just trying to attack the cow, but it won't let go. And finally, it just kind of gives up on the calf, starts kind of retreating. Terry ends up getting his rifle, a high-powered rifle, and takes a shot at the wolf one more time. But again, it just has no impact on the wolf. And the wolf just, at some point, just as, I guess, bored, turns around and kind of trots off into the woods. After they kind of were brought out of that initial trance, that they remembered this horrible smell that's like foul, almost chemical smell that just permeated the whole area after the wolf was there. Terry and his son, they decided to go track this wolf because now there's this massive predator that's going to make owning cattle extremely difficult, and so they would have to go deal with this predator. And so instead of retreating into the house, they grab their weapons and they track the wolf that's now jogged off into the forest. And they make it to an area in the forest where the ground is very muddy and sodden. And Terry could easily make out these footprints that just suddenly stop. And they just couldn't make sense of it. And so they went back to the house and they told their family, like, we tracked it into the woods. There's no blood trail. There's nothing. It just walked in and vanished. So this is day one of being at this ranch, and they're all on edge now. The whole family is on edge. They really don't know what to make of that wolf. The sheer size of it, the fact that it was totally unaffected by being shot multiple times. There's real concern over their own livelihood because they keep cattle and they're only going to have more that are going to be out in these pens. And if there are wolves that are 3 times the size of a normal wolf that are walking around killing cattle, that's a big problem if you own cattle. And so they're on edge, and they're all in a way trying almost not to talk about how crazy and how bizarre that encounter with the wolf was. They're just like, they're treating it like it's just a normal predator problem. Like, man, we gotta get those wolves, we gotta protect our cattle. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're like, something very strange is happening here. Gwen, she was having some other very strange things that were happening to her that she was not tying to the wolf thing. She was just noticing a couple of distinct things that were happening to her that made her think that she actually had a very real medical problem, that she had true memory issues. Because 2 things happened. One, in that first week, she had gone to the grocery store, and when she came back, she put the groceries away, and then she left to go to the other room, and when she came back, all the groceries were now back in the bags. And so for 20 minutes, she's just sitting there dumbfounded with, did I put the groceries away? Same day, she goes to take a shower, and she hangs her towel in the bathroom like anyone would, and she takes a shower, and then when she gets out, the towel's missing. And she's like, she gets another towel and she towels off, and then she finds the towel hanging up in a closet on the other side of the house. And so between the groceries and the towel, she's like, is there something wrong with me? Am I having a stroke? Am I having a medical issue here that I'm literally losing my mind? And it wasn't until Terry actually had a similar experience that she started to wonder if this had to do with maybe that strangeness with the wolf, that maybe there's just something odd happening about this property. And it was Terry, in that first week, he had been digging holes for a new fence. And he had this big fence digging tool. It was about 70 pounds that he was using to dig the holes for the fence. And so he had taken a break after making a bunch of posts for this fence, he took a break, left his fence digging tool, at the last place he had dug a post, and he went in to grab a bite to eat, came back out, and his fence digger is missing. And initially he just goes into the house and he's like, hey, to his wife, to his kids, like, did you guys move my fence digger? Like, do you know what happened to it? Like, where is it? It's not out there. And they're like, no, we've been in the house the whole time. I have no idea. And so they couldn't find it. And a week goes by, and he's out patrolling his property looking for wolves. And in the tree, like well away from where he had been digging the post before, in the tree, his fence digging tool that's 70 pounds is like 70 feet in the air, strung up in this tree. So Terry comes back to the house and he tells his family about the fence digging tool being in the tree. And that's when Gwen tells Terry about her experiences with the groceries going back in the bag and a towel being moved around the house. And everybody in the family starts to really start being scared. We can't explain what's happening on this property, and we're very isolated. And what's the deal with all these locks on all the doors? I mean, they're starting to feel really concerned. Following the fence digging tool being found, Terry started to notice lights on his property. Initially, because this was the first couple of weeks they're there, he would see lights way at the far end of his property that looked like headlights, and he would think someone must have made a wrong turn that wound up on my property, and we were kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and they'll just leave. And so when he first started seeing these lights, that's what he assumed it was, just people making a wrong turn. But he started to see it so often that he wondered if people were illegally hunting on his property. And so one night he sees these lights on his property and he goes out to investigate. In fact, he's angry. He's had all these strange things happen. His family's on edge, and now he's mad and he's going to take it out on this person who's illegally hunting on his property. And he starts charging out to these lights, and he starts getting closer and closer, and he starts to realize it's not making any sound. If this was like a truck, it's not making any sound. And we're in an area where I could totally hear that if it was a vehicle, and he can't hear anything. And as he gets closer and closer, the lights start retreating from him without making a sound, and then float up into the sky and disappear. And Terry's like, what is going on here? The winter rolls around, and it's a particularly brutal winter. And one night he couldn't account for one of his cows, and so he's out looking for this one stray cow, and he searches his whole property, and there's only one area that he hasn't searched, and it's that forest where that giant wolf had disappeared after marching in there, and they tracked it in there. And so he goes in there, and as soon as he gets to the tree line, he notices there's a bunch of footprints from what looks like a cow. And he's relieved because it's probably his. He follows it into the woods, and much like the wolf that had just disappeared in that muddy, sodden area in the forest, in the same spot, the footprints that appeared to be this cow had also just, disappeared. And then over the course of the remainder of the winter, that would happen 4 more times. The animals would run away and just disappear without a trace. By the end of the winter, after all these animals have just mysteriously disappeared, Terry and his family, but Terry in particular, has really gone into full paranoia mode. He, at night, would just stalk his own property, hiding behind bushes with his weapon, and hope to see what was taking his cattle. And so one night, as he's doing another fruitless search around his property, he catches out of his periphery what looks like a kind of mass of something moving around in the trees near his property. And at this point, he was kind of obscured by some shrubs and some plants. And so he kind of crouched down and looked out at the tree line. And he sees in the tree line this strange shape kind of moving about inside of the trees. And he would describe the mass as looking almost like a stealth fighter jet, but really small. And it was making no sound, and it was hovering about 20 feet off the ground. And he's crouched down, not making a sound, watching it. And it's just kind of moving around the tree line. And it has these lights it looks to be kind of scanning the ground. And it's just kind of moving around. It's shining these lights, these multicolored lights in the ground. And Terry moves a tiny bit to get a better angle on this thing. And he makes the tiniest of noises against the brush, just like a tiny little, barely audible sound. And this mass that's pretty far away, the lights immediately turn off, and it angles itself so it's facing directly at Terry. And Terry can feel it right away that it's heard this tiny little sound he's made, and now it's staring directly at Terry. And Terry's terrified, and he's looking at this thing, wondering oh my God, is it gonna come take me? What is this? Is this the thing that's been taking my livestock? And he's terrified. and he's staring at it, and it just flies away. By the spring of 1995, things have gotten really, really bad for Terry and his family. Now, not only are they losing livestock inexplicably, but they're showing up. The actual cows themselves are showing up back on their property, hours or days later, just kind of in random locations on the property, and they look like they've had surgery done, like precision cuts, and pieces of them are missing. And in addition, some very strange things are happening at the house. At night, they would see these entities walking around their property, these humanoid, they described them as having no expression, just walking around their property. And sometimes they would walk right up to the glass, put their hands on the glass and look in, but there was no face. And like Terry and his family, they had blinds down and they would use the deadbolts on every single door and window, but they could hear them rapping at the glass, and they could hear them communicating in a language they didn't understand right outside of their house. And this became so regular that it was almost impossible to sleep. Terry's kids started performing very poorly in school because they weren't sleeping. Terry's wife, Gwen, she lost her job at the bank because she wasn't sleeping and she was like delusional. They were all just at an absolute breaking point. Terry is now feeling totally disheartened. One night he's sitting on his porch with his rifle, and he notices out on the horizon a new phenomenon. He was used to seeing the lights on his property that would be off in the distance that would disappear, and he had previously seen that kind of like fighter jet thing that was scanning the area. Like, those are two types of lights he would see, but there was a new light he saw as he's sitting on his porch. It was almost like this orangey orb that appeared off in the distance. Since he had his rifle with a high-powered scope on it, he just lifts up his rifle and he looks through his high-powered scope and he zooms in all the way, and he can see that this orb, he describes it as a portal. That as he's looking at it, it has almost like an oval shape to it, and even though it was nighttime, in the middle of the orange orb is this blue sky. It's as if he's looking through a portal into another world where it's broad daylight and there's a sky. And he doesn't know what to make of it, but he can see that a black figure is crawling out of this portal into his property. And it looks just like the black entities that were basically walking around his property at night. In addition to these figures that are crawling, like imagine that scene from The Ring where the girl crawls out of the well. They're crawling out of this portal into his property and then scurrying away into the tree line. And he sees weird craft as well coming into his property through this portal, and then the portal shuts and disappears. Following this night with the orange portal, Terry started to notice blue orbs that he and his family would say were the worst and most terrifying thing of all of the things they experienced. And considering they had tall, featureless black humanoids peering in their windows and rapping on their windows, that's saying something, okay? So a blue orb started showing up on their property. And the way they described it, Terry and his family, was whenever the orb came near you, it gave you this extreme sense of anxiety. It was almost like it was emitting this feeling that you automatically got where suddenly you were unbelievably anxious and terrified of the blue orb. And then as soon as it left, you would, not be anxious anymore. And so one night he's sitting on his porch like he had begun doing, and he sees this orb show up on his property. And his 3 dogs are sitting with him that see the orb, and they start growling and barking. And so he lets his dogs go, thinking that maybe they can scare this thing off. And the dogs take off running towards this blue orb. And they chase it, and you can see the orb, Terry can see the orb that starts to kind of retreat. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, I finally won something. My attack dogs are gonna scare this orb away. And they chase off into the woods, and he sees this thing, the blue orb, retreat into the woods. And then when he's thinking again that finally a little victory for us, he hears his dogs yelping. And he's too terrified to go check it out, and so he ends up going inside and locking the doors, locking the windows like they had been, and just kind of retreating. So the next day, when the dogs haven't returned, Terry and his son, they go out looking for the dogs in the forest. And when they get out there, they get to a clearing and they find 3 stacks of ashes in like little burned out circles, as if there had been a fire previously in these 3 little spots. And it turned out it was the ashes of his 3 dogs that had gone into the woods. They had just been vaporized. Terry decides that it's time to leave, and he wants to sell the ranch. And so he puts the property up for sale and goes to a local news outlet, and he tells them about what's happening on his property. And as fate would have it, a billionaire by the name of Robert Bigelow, who had invested millions of dollars in standing up this scientific research team, this all-star team of PhDs, specifically to research what he described as high strangeness, which really is just paranormal. Basically, he was obsessed with the paranormal and wanted to investigate the paranormal. And he had actually seen that fairly obscure story. When he saw that it was up for sale, Robert Bigelow, the billionaire, saw this great opportunity to buy the piece of property and actually make it the headquarters of his own scientific research team. Not only to investigate what was happening on Skinwalker Ranch, but use it as kind of a hub to do other scientific research. So he purchases the ranch, and Terry actually, even though he did not want to spend any time at the ranch, on some level wanted to know what the research was going to show, because he was very curious, like, what is going on at this ranch that's been plaguing my family. So he offers to stay on as kind of like the ranch manager, because, you know, Robert Bigelow and his team are a bunch of scientists and business people. They don't have any experience on the ranch, and so they're happy to keep him. So Terry is still connected to the ranch, but at this point he's sold it to Robert Bigelow. So Robert Bigelow's scientific team was called the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, N-I-D-S, NIDS for short. And Bigelow had actually built the team before purchasing Skinwalker Ranch. And what he went out and did is he recruited some of the most incredible scientists and PhDs he could possibly recruit, but he didn't want people that were interested in the paranormal. He wanted people that were inherently skeptical, so that if he was ever able to kind of prove the existence of high strangeness, that he would have credibility in doing that. And so he went out and found these incredibly skeptical, incredibly smart scientists and PhDs. And so they move into Skinwalker Ranch, and the first thing they do is they need to start doing testing to make sure that this whole, all the stories about Skinwalker Ranch coming from Terry and his family were not just some grand illusion by the family, that, you know, they could have just made it up. And so they get in there and they start running these tests. So that first year, as they're running these tests, which are largely things like, okay, let's check the environment and see if there aren't any, you know, plants that are giving off spores that could be hallucinogenic that they're breathing in. Let's check their water supply and make sure there wasn't something happening in their water supply. Let's do psychological assessments of the family. Let's ask neighbors. Let's do all of our diligence to make sure it's not something environmental or psychological. And over that first year, while they're doing this research, there isn't much activity at the ranch, save a couple of instances where there were some strange lights. So that first year is fairly uneventful, but what's important is that the NIDS researchers come to a conclusion that this did not seem like a hallucination. This did not seem like a something coming from, you know, a plant or water supply. This seemed like the Terry and his family were really experiencing something odd. They just didn't know what it was. One day, Terry and actually Gwen, who was helping him, were tagging some of the new calves, the new cows that had been born, putting these little tags in their ears. And so Gwen was there helping. And so Terry and Gwen, they tagged this new calf, put a yellow tag in its ear, and they move on and they're tagging other animals. And so for about 40 minutes, their eyes and their attention are not focused on this one calf or that one area of the ranch. They're tagging other animals, and then their dog that was with them starts growling and reacting in the direction of where this calf had been. And so Terry and Gwen turn around and they look and they don't see anything, and they start walking over. They find the calf that they had tagged about 40 minutes ago has been basically surgically dissected, and all that's left are its legs and its head. And in addition, the ear where that tag was had been removed. And so they immediately call over the NIDS researchers. So the NIDS veterinarian comes over and looks at the scene and just can't make sense of it, because the incisions on the calf were so well done that it looked like someone with real surgical expertise had done this on an operating table. There was no sign that this was done by a predator, and there was no blood anywhere. So this prompts a massive search of the property, because in many ways, this is what the NIDS researchers are looking for, are real occurrences of something that is highly strange that they can go investigate. And so all of the researchers and everybody there begins searching the property for whoever was responsible for this dissection of the cow. And they start searching the property, and the dogs, they had all these guard dogs that were kept at each of these observation posts that they had set up around the ranch as soon as the NIDS team had moved in. They were all looking in the same direction, all four of these four observation posts, and they're all cowering in the back of their cages, all looking in the same direction. And so they start making their way towards the tree line where all these dogs are looking, and they stop short when Terry says, "I see something in the tree." So they stop their car and they're looking, and in the tree is this massive wolf, this like wolf-like humanoid that's basically perched on a tree limb. And Terry takes out his rifle and he aims at the creature up in the tree, this huge creature, and everybody sees it. All the NIDS researchers are looking at this creature and they're like, "Oh my God, what is that?" Terry starts firing at this thing and it just disappears into the woods. And so the team charges into the woods, they fan out, and they pick up a couple of tracks of this huge thing that has like this massive footprint with these huge claws. But much like the wolf that had disappeared and the cattle that had suddenly disappeared when they went into the woods, they couldn't find any traces of this thing. But they did smell this horrible stench that Terry remembered smelling. It stuck with him that first day when that large wolf had come over on the very first day they were moving in. It was that same smell, but they couldn't find this huge animal. So dumbfounded, the NIDS researchers just go back to the property and no one can make sense of it. And they have the footprint and they have their own eyewitness testimony, but like they couldn't make sense of how something that big could just get away. And so over the following month, they're like searching the property and they're looking for any more signs of this huge creature or anything. The only thing they noticed is that the guard dogs consistently stayed in their kennels and did not want to come out. They were acting like they were kind of being hunted, and they were they were cowering quite a bit, and they were scared to go out in the open, but they couldn't find anything. So it was around this time that Terry and Gwen are kind of back to doing work around the ranch, and one day they're driving off to one section of the ranch and they pass by the corral where 4 of their prized bulls were. These are very expensive animals that are all in this enclosure. And so they drive past and they take a mental note that they're seeing these bulls in this enclosure, and they drive off to the other side of the ranch where they're doing some work, tagging animals and, building fences, whatever it is they were doing. But when they come back and they round a corner where they're first able to see that corral of bulls again, they are like, where are they? Because the bulls were not in their enclosure and they weren't anywhere. And so they're panicked because these are very expensive animals, and they run over, and Terry sees that the gates to the corral are still locked, but there's no bulls in there. There's no sign of a struggle or anything. And it just so happens that right next to the corral was this fairly small trailer that hadn't been used in years. In fact, it was literally wired shut. It was just sitting there. And Terry, just for whatever reason, runs over and looks in one of the windows. And inside of this tiny enclosure are these 4 bulls, completely calm, all crammed into this tiny trailer. They could barely fit. They're not fighting with each other or anything. They're just calmly sitting there as if they're in some kind of a trance. And Terry yells to Gwen, like, "Hey, they're over here. They're right here." And it like startles the bulls out of their trance. They start panicking and kicking, and they end up getting them out of this enclosure, and it takes them hours to finally round them up and get them back in the corral. But they're unharmed. But it is almost impossible to get even one bull into that small of an enclosure. It would take hours to maybe be successful at doing that. To get 4 bulls into that enclosure was pretty much impossible. And to do it when they basically were calm after they were in there is also somewhat impossible. And it was important to note that Terry saw when he looked in the window that the only entrance to that trailer was wired shut still. It had not been undone. In fact, the cobwebs at the corner where the opening basically formed with the sides of the trailer, they were still intact, like it had not opened. And it made no sense how those bulls got in there. And so the NIDS researchers come over and they can't make sense of it either. Upon further investigation, the NIDS researchers found that the bars of the corral that held the bulls a section of it had been highly magnetized. And so while they're doing this research, trying to figure out if magnetic fields has anything to do with the strange occurrences at the ranch, two of the NIDS researchers were on the outskirts of the property using their compass to look for magnetic fields, and they started smelling. They both reported smelling that horrible metallic, like rotting smell that other people had reported smelling anytime they saw that large wolf creature. And when they started smelling it, their compass started to flitter and then pointed away from north towards wherever the smell was. And they remember thinking that they felt like they were being watched. And it went on for a few moments, and their compass didn't waver. It was aimed in the direction of the smell, and they're both on opposite sides, pointing in the same direction. And then at some point, the smell stops, and they stop feeling anxious, and the north arrows go back to the way they should have been. And then one of the most terrifying of all of the paranormal occurrences that happened at Skinwalker Ranch happened at the very end of 1997. Two NIDS researchers were up on a ridgeline overlooking the homestead. Every night it became commonplace to basically position NIDS researchers all over the property to basically be on the lookout for weird things that are happening. And these two researchers are up on this ridge, kind of obscured and hidden, and they see this orange orb take shape right near the homestead. And one of them had infrared goggles, and so he looks down at the orb, and he can clearly make out that it's this oval-shaped opening that sounded an awful lot like what Terry had seen on his porch when he saw that humanoid creature crawling out of the portal into his property. Well, these two researchers are looking at this portal, and they see the same thing. They see this black human-like creature